Hello, in this video you will see how to use MudBlazor in Blazor. MudBlazor is a component library that can save you quite a lot of time, especially when building those admin panels, perhaps something more in-house. And of course you can customize the styles for your own needs. It has been around from the early versions of Blazor and now available in .NET 10. There are some changes, some new things, and this the particular tutorial will be completely up to date as of now, so you'll be able to learn all the latest and greatest stuff. And this will be a series of things. In this video, we'll just get started with things. I'll show you how to set it up. It works on server, it all works on auto, it works on all the Blazor arrangements that you can find. For the .NET 10, we're using Visual Studio 2026 now. And basically, this component library is free. If you don't know about MudBlazor, again, it's been around forever, from basically the start of Blazor, and it's well sponsored, it's well maintained, and it is, most importantly, free, and it has all the features such as tables and everything. And you'll see in these examples that I'll provide how you can use it and what you can actually achieve. So now, just to get started, let's set it up. Let's install all the NuGet packages and do all the other additional setup, and then we'll get into the actual example, how to use certain basic components and sort of interact with them. So in order to get started, we first, of course, need to install a NuGet package. And here we have a Blazor server, essentially fully server, not per page, not anything, just global server rendering project. But it will work in a very similar way with all the other arrangements. One thing I need to note, you should always, whenever starting a new project, you should go to mudblazor.com to their documentation. There will be a link provided to that. But basically just copy everything you need for the setup from there, because from different versions they do change a few things a bit. You will probably have a general idea, but perhaps something changes and maybe it will cause a few problems. Usually they're quite good with sort of updates, and they don't cause too many sort of differences in things, so it should be all good. But it's always a good idea to just go there and reference that. But let's get started by going to NuGet packages, and in this case we will just search for MudBlazor. This is what it's called, and we don't need anything else except for the main package, MudBlazor. Quite a popular one, as you can see from a download count, and again it offers quite a few options, anything from buttons to inputs to dialogues, form handling if you want that as well. So anything you need really in terms of Blazor. Now the next thing, we should go to imports. In this case, in the previous versions, it might have been in a different place. Things do change in Blazor, of course. In .NET 10, it's still in the components, the imports.razor. And this is where we will just put using MudBlazor. Now this is just so we don't have to reference MudBlazor with every MudBlazor component that we use in all the pages. So we have that ready, and now we can go to the program.cs. So essentially we will do this reference, and you also need to inject some services, because they do use services for certain things. And then also we'll update the routes.razor to include some other things. But let's just do this, and for this we don't need too much really. We just need to add in the builder mud services. So add mud services, and that's all we need, at least for now. So just a simple one-liner, essentially, nothing more to do. Now let's go to app.razor, or rather let's go to not app.razor but routes.razor, and then we can see right here we have everything. Now the reason we are in routes.razor, this is kind of an important thing to mention. If you are working perhaps with an earlier version, there would be different files. So it used to be that you go to app.razor, which was sort of a router thing, and then you have the host. So that's where you would go in the earlier versions. Now, you go to app.razor and essentially just add all those necessary bits and pieces in here. What we can do here, we can just, basically what I'm doing, I'm copying from the actual reference. That's what you should do. Never sort of try to do it on your own. There's no point in that. It can cause problems. You may forget something, and then it's going to be some weirdness, and it will be quite difficult to debug, especially if you're adding this to some older projects. So again, in .NET 10, you add it above routes, because this routes.razor, but in earlier versions, it would be a different thing. So always consider that possibility that you might need to add some of these components to a different part of the project. But essentially, with this, it should be all set up, at least to some extent. Now, the best thing to do at this point would be just to try it out. And I always liked, if I'm starting from a new project and adding this sort of stuff, I would just add a simple button to the home page, essentially to index.razor or to home.razor, and just to try it out, because we don't want to go any further without seeing the project working, without seeing the project loading. It's always a big mistake to just do that. So let's try and add a bit of a trial here. For that, let's go to the pages in the components, the pages, that's the default project structure, nothing too interesting here. Let's go to this, and instead of hello world, we can leave that part in just so we are sure we're not missing anything. Welcome to a new app, that's what we don't need, a little suggestion that we didn't need. But what we can do is create a mud button. So MudBlazor components in general will start with mud. MudBlazor, as you can see, mud badge we have. So let's do mud button. And it gives us, Visual Studio is quite smart these days, especially with all the Copilot integrations. It gives us some example. Well, click me, perhaps not the right word for it. Let's do a very basic one, because we don't want to do something too fancy for testing purposes. So in this case, we just have a basic button, and as you can see, it has some predetermined colors and variants. There are 3 variants, essentially filled and outlined, and basic sort of one. And the colors, there are a few colors. So you have your primary buttons, your like warning buttons and error buttons. And there is a way to change it as a theme, so you can actually override those colors. Now, sometimes you do want to go a bit deeper. There are actually styles and classes you can add. Classes are a bit more tricky. Perhaps we'll get to that a bit more deeply in these series in the next videos. Styles, you can kind of directly override existing styles for the mud button, but of course for the more complex components like selects, drop downs and things like that, it won't be as straightforward. So if you want to sort of really customize that, it will get perhaps a bit more tricky. But really, this isn't too much about the customization. It's more about ease of use and just having something ready and available. So now let's launch it and see what happens. So now when launched, we don't actually see the proper MudBlazor button, as you can see right here. The reason is because I personally forgot to add the references to the style sheets. So let's close this. Let's get back to the code, and very quickly we can get from essentially the documentation, and we can go into in this case app.raise it would be, and we just need to add some style sheets. Very straightforward arrangement. What we add here is fonts, and you can customize fonts as well, but you'll need to customize the theme, which we'll get back to a bit later. But essentially we do need to add this MudBlazor style sheet. So once we do that, it should work quite perfectly now. And now we have a button that doesn't do anything, but nonetheless we have a button. So from here, now I can see the setup is all ready, and you see why it's always a good idea to kind of try and run it at some point just with a basic one single button or one single input, whatever that be, just so we can see that the style sheets are applied, that everything gets rendered, the page doesn't crash. Because imagine if you build a whole dashboard before actually launching it. Let's say you don't add some reference in program.cs to register the dependency, for example, then the page might crash and you won't know why. It may lead you to some basically useless search for problems that don't exist. But now we have it, so what we should do now, let's try and build a little layout with MudBlazor and see how that goes in terms of all the navigation bars and just in general the layouts. Because just like Bootstrap, for example, you can have layouts. So let's look a bit at that. For the layout, of course, we need to go to the main layout .razor, and this is a sort of bare bones project, so there's not much really that we have going on here. But essentially with MudBlazor you kind of have several options to work with. You can of course use just Bootstrap for layouts, or you can use your completely custom layout mechanism. It is a matter of preference, a matter of cost, perhaps sometimes, but perhaps a matter of time, depending on what you want. But since this is a MudBlazor tutorial, we will go with MudBlazor layout. And for MudBlazor layout, you can probably guess what the keyword will be, and Visual Studio in its almighty suggestive power is already suggesting us a Mud layout, and also it actually suggesting us a Mud app bar, which we will use in this case anyway. So let's try to go with a suggestion, which with MudBlazor and all the other libraries in Blazor don't always work that well with those suggestions. Sort of partially we got something, but partially we also didn't. But it's okay. That's what we need. We can get rid of this mud text, so we won't use it. But now we have a Mud layout. So this is essentially quite similar to Bootstrap, if you are familiar with that. We will be using grids, and we will be putting items in them. Of course, now we need some kind of a bar, and you can have a navigation bar. And in general, the suggestion would be to probably have a custom-made navigation bar and then use layouts just for the content. Again, it depends on your needs, it depends on your scale of a project, but customizing the actual navigation bar, if you use something default from MudBlazor, can be a bit tricky. So if you start from scratch, it will be easier to customize, and if you need something based on perhaps a Figma design, it's probably a good idea to just start from scratch right away. But what we can do with these, with quite a few components in MudBlazor, is use elevation. So this is similar to Z-index and all those arrangements, but essentially you kind of have one element above the other, and you can create all kinds of shadows, so it floats nicely on top of a background or on top of another element. It's quite a useful thing. And we also have option to have it dense or not dense. So dense essentially will be dense, and not dense will be false, and not dense. Kind of self-explanatory. Now, one thing to sort of note, we will also add a bit of a class to have a kind of a sizing arrangement. These are essentially like bootstrap classes, so you can have M2, M5, you can have call MD4. It does sort of work in a similar way, and in the same way, really. So let's have a class here, and let's do MB4. So now we have some kind of a app bar, perhaps a navigation bar of sorts, but we need to have some content. So let's just do a couple of buttons. This is kind of similar to one of those generic things that used to be provided in Blazor templates, and you can still get that as well. But let's do like a mud icon button for this, and we also get the whole suggestion. Essentially, this will be a drawer, so it's kind of like a default thing. If you're not interested in the layouts, feel free to skip to the next part. We'll get into the actual components, like buttons and things, but if you are interested, feel free to watch this part, because it is quite important to know the layouts if you are going to use them. Maybe you won't, maybe you will. It depends on your needs once again. The good thing about MudBlazor in general is there another mud icon button. You see there's mud icon and there's mud icon button. So button is essentially clickable. Mud icon you can just put inside real buttons as well. You can just have a button with your custom classes and just put in mud icon. They have a very nice list of icons you can choose from. You can browse through them, search them, and then just use them in your code when you find the appropriate one. So a very useful thing. Or you can have an icon button which essentially is already pre-made, fully working button with all the hover interactions, all the hover and click effects. So all, very sort of straightforward thing if you need that. Let's not do search. Maybe let's do something like this one, vertical. And the interesting thing, it provides just a constant path, so you can kind of even extract the whole thing and use it without MudBlazor itself. Again, it's very customizable, and you can definitely get something done in that sort of a regard. Now, this suggestion was given by default by the Visual Studio, shall we say, and we will leave it because we'll need to toggle the drawer, so why not just leave it. And the drawer will expand and will give us something. So again, we do have a little suggestion. This one we will probably skip a bit, but let's create a drawer. So this will expand from the side essentially, in kind of any drawer in any library would do. Let's just write that like that. These suggestions, depending on your settings in Visual Studio, have become sort of a bit more perhaps intrusive in the later versions. We want open, and in order to have open, we will actually need to have a bit of code at this point. So let's do code like that, like that, like that, and we don't even need to waste time. We have a whole suggestion. Now, you may have noticed in this case, I just press the tab on the keyboard and I use the suggestion. In general, you want to be careful, especially when working with MudBlazor. If you are customizing something, you should sort of, in the more complex arrangements of customization, you should try and avoid using all these suggestions. And if you're using GitHub Copilot, in many cases, again, when changing those tiny bits and maybe changing the classes, overriding the classes, you should probably avoid in general and avoid huge changes, especially if you're not backed up, if you don't have your commits to sort of fall back to, because they can go very wrong very quickly, so you kind of want to be careful with that. But in any case, now with bind open, we can use this suggestion. Why not? Bind open, we have that, and let's do a little elevation on this one as well, so it matches our Mud app bar. That should be quite fine, and Mud drawers have different elements as well inside them. So we have Mud drawer header we want, actually. Let's see, Mud drawer header, and then we also have the container that can have essentially a few different things in that. This should work perfectly fine, the menu, and at some point we also need to just launch this. So we have main layout, and in the main layout, everything needs to go into the main layout. Essentially, that's where your body will go, and that's where everything goes if you are using the Mud layouts. And in that we have a Mud app bar, and then basically we have just Mud main content. Now, this is quite good in a sense that it's all ready to go. Mud main content is already tested by many people to work with all kinds of arrangements. The problem is, if you do stick to this arrangement, you will very likely need to use it throughout the whole platform, the whole application, because if you don't, customizing the layouts can be a bit tricky. So if you have some perhaps more fancy arrangement in terms of your navigation bars, maybe you have things coming from all sides, suggestions for the user, and some perhaps more visually complex application, you might want to avoid that and do your custom layout. So it really depends on your needs. In general, most applications will be perfectly fine with this, and it will make your life easier because, again, this library, it's a very popular one, so it's been tested, it's been done before, and it should work quite well. But inside the main content, this is kind of like in the previous templates, you would get the body in the main tag, essentially. So this is all it is. The actual structure of the layouts comes from the containers, and then items, and then grids, and all those things. So let's just put in the body. We don't need text here, where the text will come probably from all the pages, but we have the main Mud container, and you do want to use max width and max width large. That makes a sort of properly, at least somewhat full page. And again, you can use, at this point, you can probably use div and just put everything in one div, and then you can have your custom ones, you can have a bootstrap ones. It's just, if you want to go fully with this, you go fully with this. If you don't, you don't. But at this point, we have a drawer arrangement that should work with this arrangement. You have bind open, so if it's open, it's open. If it's not, it's not. It's just toggling true, false on drawer open. That should work perfectly fine. And at this point, we can take a look at the code and see what it looks like. So now it's launched, we do have a drawer which is pre-expanded. We can just change the setting on that. Doesn't matter, but essentially we have this sort of a menu. You see right here on the right, we have a sort of a toggle, and you can do stuff in it. However, in general, as far as nav bars go and that sort of an arrangement, it's not the best in MudBlazor, so the suggestion would be to do your own, or perhaps use some alternatives, but generally these days you can find decent samples with CSS and all the other needed bits and pieces to kind of do it, and there's no problem with that. You can still use this one, but again, it does get a bit tricky. So now we have the layout. Let's move a bit forward and let's create some more visual examples and some more interactive examples, just so you can see all the on-clicks and inputs and how to bind these things and how to perhaps override a few things as well. For the next step, we'll need a separate page. We'll try to build a little dashboard, essentially, from scratch with all the components. But before we do that, we'll need to test it at some point. And as I mentioned previously, if you have a choice, if you can just get quickly to the page you're working on, it's better to test it as soon as possible, because mixing different bits and pieces, different components together can create problems and more problems and more possibilities for weird exceptions that you don't know where they come from and all that. So it's better to launch as soon as possible, and with that we will create a little nav menu as well. So in a mud drawer, in this case, since we are going sort of fully MudBlazor, we'll create a navigation menu, and for that we'll create a separate component in the layout. So in the components and layout folder, let's do new component, and the new component we will simply call nav menu, because that's what it is, nav menu. For now we'll just put one item in it, just so it's very simple and straightforward. However, we will still use a component from MudBlazor. Oh, that's not the best suggestion in the world. Let's go instead with mud nav menu, like that, like that, like that. And we certainly don't need all those suggestions. We could have something like this actually, but let's start from scratch. Basically, we're building a dashboard for now. We'll look at some other components later, but let's do mud nav link. So just like if you customize your own, you can still use mud nav link. If you have it like a div in some actual nav menu, you could still use mud nav link. Or alternatively, you could actually use a tag. It doesn't make too much of a difference whether you use this or not. You can use all these match for queries and things like that, but essentially you can just use a tag. In general, it won't make much of a difference. But again, since we're doing a MudBlazor arrangement, let's do a full MudBlazor arrangement like that. So for this purpose, let's say we'll have a page called dashboard, and we'll create a new page in a moment. And we can also do in MudNavLink what we can't exactly do so directly in an a tag, is we can do an icon. So we can do icon, let's say add icon. So all the icons come from icons. And then material, you choose what the icon is: rounded, filled, two-tone, outlined. All the suggestions are here. However, if you want to actually pick the icon, and if you have a designer perhaps working with you, you might want to provide them that web page in mudblazor.com where they have all the icons listed. So then your designer can sort of implement the proper exact icon that you'll use from MudBlazor in their designs, and then the design is matching exactly. So that's always a good idea, and that's why it's always a good idea to start from the actual design, not from some basic development and then apply design. But and if you're using MudBlazor, of course, that will definitely save a lot of time, because customizing things can be quite tricky. And of course, you can put this in an A tag. You can use icon component from MudBlazor, put it in an A tag, but this is already set up. All the layouts, all the margins, all the paddings are already there, so you won't actually need to worry. Let's do a filled one in this case, and let's do what do we have? We do have dashboard, I believe, in here. Yes, we do have dashboard. So we're building a dashboard, and we have a dashboard. That's perfect. Perfect. What more can we ask for? And we can get rid of code. We don't need the code part. Now back to the main layout, and let's just add it here. Let's see, nav menu. Can we add it? We can add it. So now nav menu is added. And at this point, once again, since we added somewhat a complex part here, it's always a good idea to launch it and check what it looks like. And let's see if we have that navigation link, which will at this point go nowhere. So we indeed have a navigation link with our dashboard icon here. However, the color of the text is probably not exactly existing. Let's inspect the element just to kind of check it out quickly. Do we have a text? Let's expand the A. Let's expand. Let's see. Do we not have a text? We don't have a text. So that's a very sort of dumb mistake, but let's correct it quickly. We do actually need to have a bit of text for the actual navigation. Let's go back to the nav menu right here, and let's say it's dashboard. So kind of a simple arrangement, but again, as you saw, you can go into that and check what actually is in there in terms of sort of regular CSS and HTML. Of course, even this component, it kind of goes to different parts. You have this div, and you have SVG, and you have, well, nothing in that case, as you saw. But now we'll have dashboard, so that's all great and good. But some of the more advanced components, it can be quite difficult. And again, if you want to override a certain bit of the component, you'll need to override a certain class in a certain way, in a certain subclass of CSS, and that can get quite tricky. That's why if you're using MudBlazor, you should sort of stick to a generic theme. Although it's fully customizable, it can be quite a bit tricky to actually go and customize it. So now we should have this all working, and let's create the actual dashboard. At this point, we should create another page in Pages called Dashboard, and build a little dashboard. This will be nothing too fancy, but we'll have a bit of fake data and just kind of experience the flow of creating a grid based completely on MudBlazor, nothing else. Let's create that component, and let's visually sort of look at it. And this whole code fully prepared and ready for exploration will be available on Patreon, as well as some free courses. Let's not call it Mud Dashboard, let's call it just a dashboard, because that is the name of the page. And let's get into that a bit. The first thing we need to do is, of course, match the route to the route. See, we have a suggestion, but as always, with all these routing mechanisms, whether it's API or a Blazor page, we should check if it is actually available, if it's matching with the links that we have. So here we have href dashboard, and here we have page called dashboard. Now, this will go into main layout right here, mud main content, and then mud container. Now, in the mud container, we still need another container essentially, which will be a mud grid. So let's do mud grid. like that. No, we don't need any of that, but we just have a MudGrid. Now, MudGrid is followed by mud items. Let's write one item, and if you are familiar with something like Bootstrap, you'll quickly realize how not even similar, but almost exactly the same it is. So this essentially would be like a grid in the whole Bootstrap arrangement, or a div rather, the element. And this would be another div which could sort of be considered like a row. So if you have class row in Bootstrap, you'll have here call MD something and call SM something and all those things. If you're not familiar, it doesn't matter. A very straightforward example here. So for example, XS, this would be, and we can use the suggestion just so we have this content right away. So XS we have. This is for smaller screens. At some point it will shift to this. What 12 means, it means it's gonna expand throughout the whole width. There's 12 points, shall we say, on the whole width. So if we have, say, for example, on SM, which is a regular screen, or MD, we should go for perhaps. MD is larger, SM is sort of regular. And we have a bit of a description which doesn't really mean a lot. But essentially here we have 6. The total is 12. So if we copy this mud item and we have this, you should have right here in MudGrid a row of 2 mud items. They should fit in a row in most normal screens. Because it's 6 and 6 equals 12, 2 of them should fit perfectly fine. Now, on the other hand, if we have, say, like this, then the third one will go into the new row on this SM arrangement, so normal screen, shall we say. But then if you have 4 and 4 and 4, then in that case, they should, at least in theory, depending if you add some custom margins and all those things, so they should fit in one line. Again, if you're familiar with Bootstrap, there's no need to probably explain that, but if you're not, essentially you have 12. The grid for the row, you can consider it like that, is 12, so whatever number you put in and however items you may have in that row will depend on the number and then on the total of those items added together in the MudGrid. But let's get back to something a bit more tricky perhaps. And let's go with let's go with 6, so it's a bit bigger and easier to see perhaps. We have mud item, and in the mud item we will add something called MudPaper. Now MudPaper, once you will see it, it will be easier to kind of realize what it actually is. Essentially, MudPaper is kind of a container. In Bootstrap, you used to have, back in probably quite a few years ago, we used to have something called Jumbotron, a sort of perhaps a bit elevated kind of an item with shadows of floating container essentially. So that's what MudPaper is, like a piece of paper on the background, nothing more to it. But it will act as a very nice container. And MudPapers, they do have elevation. If I can actually put the elevation inside the properties here. So elevation can go again through different numbers. If you only have 1 or 2, it makes no difference compared to other elements. It just sort of essentially gives a bigger perhaps box shadow and things of that nature. So it's either more or less elevated. And let's add a bit of a class. And again, the classes, you sort of use them as Bootstrap classes, but they aren't exactly Bootstrap. They are MudBlazor. So we can try some of them just to some extent. Let's say PA4 will have a bit of a movement there, just so it's not sort of stuck together. And then what we can do, let's see if we can find this mud background gray. This should work, and there are several of them, but again, we kind of come to that overriding point, and there is reference for that in the official arrangement, but it can get a bit tricky. So if you do want to customize the colors, again, perhaps consider div, and also especially if you want to say have a MudPaper, a sort of a container that has perhaps some floating bubbles in the background. At that point you should just use div and your custom CSS. It will be a lot easier to customize, and this sort of stuff really doesn't add too much value. Once we get to the buttons and things like that, obviously, you have your hover shadows and box shadows and size changing perhaps. You have all those effects on releasing the button, pressing the button. So that's where it's more useful. And of course, grids, the tables. But here, if you want to go full MudBlazor, you can certainly do that, as you can see. But it may not always be advisable. So let's see what we have. MudPaper, and in MudPaper we don't need MudCard. What we can just do a bit of text. So then we do MudText, and once we launch the project, I will show you what these actually are. These are essentially like paragraph. Let's do a few of them just so we see, because MudText is essentially like P, but then it can also be H1, H2, H3. So all kinds of things it can be. It's not necessarily P tag, it's not necessarily H1 tag, it's however you determine what it needs to be. But then again, you only need to use one tag, MudText, and then you do typo, which is a strange name for it, perhaps, if you kind of think of typos as typos, but it is a typo. And typo in this case, let's say subtitle 1. So subtitle is well, subtitle as a tag would be. What we are going to do in this example, we will have users and their revenues and their active sessions, essentially, and maybe a conversion rate. There is some data pre-prepared. We won't fetch it from database in this case. Perhaps later in the series, you will see more incorporation in terms of fetching data from some database, how you can inject things alongside MudBlazor, specifically, not Blazor, and how you can do all those things in tables, make searchable tables. But for now, just a very basic thing. So let's do it on this one, on this dashboard item. Let's just do total users, and then let's do some basic, let's say on this, just some placeholders, just so we can check it a bit. A placeholder at 1250, 12,500 actually, and let's say, okay, 12% increase, like that. Just so we have some placeholders to test with. And let's do some bit of typos here. Let's say typo H4. That would be a sort of generic arrangement, and I believe the suggestion will come in now for caption, probably. Let's see if we can get a good suggestion. No, but let's just do caption, because it should at least look quite nice. And at this point, we created a bit of a grid. We created something. We should test it out. We should run it. However, we are testing a grid, and we want to test things as soon as possible, but also we are testing a grid, so we need another item. So what I would do, I would just copy this. Now, of course, in the real world, you would just delete it later on, which we'll do now. But if it works, we'll see that these two on a normal screen on which we are launching, it will be in one row. And then we are good to go with the rest of it. So let's try it out and let's see what it looks like. Now in the browser, you see the dashboard. That's all working perfectly now. Let's go to the page. And as you can see, they both fit very nicely in that one row. They aren't obviously 100% or rather 50% width, because MudPaper has all kinds of sort of sizing arrangements as well. It's sort of made to fit. So if you would want to expand them, you would need to override some of the properties, and that's something for a bit later. But in general, we do have arrangement sort of working. So let's now go and build through the whole dashboard, and let's see how the data can be loaded in and all those other things as well. Now, to finish the dashboard, let's just build up a few more things just so we can see clearly, and then let's get to the more interesting part, which is the MudTable and interaction with that, how the data gets loaded, because really this, you want to use it, you don't want to use it, perhaps you want to use your own arrangement, it doesn't make much of a difference. But when it comes to tables, building your own table, if you ever worked something similar, you probably know already it's very difficult, and this can save you many, many hours in terms of using these components versus doing something of your own design. So let's just add a couple of these things here very quickly. Let's do like this, and again, remember, this is on medium sort of size, this is on large, and this is on small. So on small, we always want to usually just drop these things sort of together. But we have three arrangements, so let's just do another one quickly. And once we get to that, it will look much better. But for these parts, at least for this video, we'll just keep some placeholders, let's say 45,000, whatever it is, and let's say 8% increase, and then another bit of a dashboard. Let's say let's do active sessions, because why not? Because we have a dashboard, and in these series we'll get to more complicated dashboards where we load the data, we can interact with them, and we have different forms. You will see how we use the forms in MudBlazor and all those things, but for now just a few straightforward things. Let's say 3%, and let's say whatever increase, let's say 3% increase. That's good enough. I think, well, we don't use percents for, let's say, 300 active sessions. Why not? Now, we have this MudGrid, and we also want something else. So now let's say, a little table. A table which will contain recent users. We have a dashboard of user activity. We have the revenues, all great and good, and then we want a little table of recent users, just to see what kind of people coming through. Maybe we can get details and whatnot, sort of something somewhat real world. But the main thing is that we can actually use a table. But just for a bit of separation, let's use something like mud text, like this. And let's say recent users. So now in this case, do notice we have MudGrid, but this is coming outside of the MudGrid. So you see that sort of interaction, how it can be done in this way, in this way as well. Because remember, MudGrid is already in some kind of a container. And if we go to the main layout, you can see it's in mud container. So everything essentially in mud container is kind of like a block display. Well, not really kind of like, but it is that essentially. So you can sort of put things like that, or you can put in different grids and do it in that sort of a way. But also it is important not to overcomplicate with grids. If you need a grid, sure, you add another one. But if you don't, you don't. Because if you add too many, just like adding too many divs, this is the same thing really. It will become more difficult to customize, and once you start testing with real users, you'll find more problems with perhaps different layouts of browsers, screens, laptops versus desktops, mobile especially. That will get a bit more tricky to debug. So you want to put as many grids as needed, and as many items, of course, as needed, not just do grid for every little thing and item for every little thing, because we could wrap mud text in a grid and put it then in an item, but that's overcomplicating things. This perhaps will be good enough, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes, and we do need just a few arrangements here so it kind of sits well. Let's say type O. Let's not make a typo when doing a type O. Let's do H5. I believe that should be quite appropriate for this mechanism. And then let's do empty12. Again, this is very much a sort of bootstrapish stuff. It is MudBlazor, but it is sort of essentially based on bootstrap arrangements, and which really became a standard over the years. Now let's build the actual MudTable. So MudTable is where things get a bit more tricky, because for the actual table we do need some items. And for the items, I do have a list already ready, so we don't waste time on this tutorial. So let's import the list and let's look at the actual table and how the items come to life in the table. So now for the table, we have this imported data. Very simple example. Essentially, we have user model, and it will be a list of it, just like most tables out there in the world, or probably all of them work in a similar way. We have a list, we have some kind of an object with properties, and those properties do get displayed in columns. One pro tip as such, if you are trying something out and you don't have any data, simply create yourself a class and generate the data using perhaps GitHub Copilot or whatever other tool you're using. Makes it much easier if you don't actually have a connection to the API, or even if you do, maybe you want to just quickly test out the table before you start connecting to the API and doing all the casting of different types and different things. Perhaps in this case, for example, the status is a string which we can easily display, but perhaps it would be enumerable. Perhaps you would have just some kind of an integer that you want to display, and depending on the value, it would be something different. So that sometimes can be a good idea to test out these more complex components, because the display might be different, and you also want to try different lengths of things, because tables, of course, they don't quite scale as well in terms of mobile layouts, and how would it drag to the side, what's the column width, and all those things. You do want to test them out in general. Now, this has been available for a few years now. It's probably one of the best tables out there, but still, it's always good to kind of double check and test it out. But basically, the way the table works, of course, let's get into it. We have the items. We need the items for the table. And for the items, we have a property in the MudTable component, which is items. Of course it is. And for that, in this case, we do use the recent users. And we also get this lovely good suggestion, which we won't use because we want to do this step by step. Essentially, a table is kind of a straightforward thing. It has some more additions. We will explore them in later videos. But in general, we just have header content, or head content in this case. We can fill it in now. It should be header content, not head content. Like that, and of course not like that. Perfect. Now we have all those properties from the user model here. So these, they do have to match with the actual values that we provide. And as far as values goes, there are sort of different ways to do that. And also, in this case, we're using MudTable, but there is a MudGrid, and with that, you have sort of more complex arrangements. But again, for just getting started, MudTable is definitely good enough. And you can probably recognize this if you ever used HTML to some extent. This is MudTH, so this is MudTable. Essentially, more or less, it's representing just actual HTML table components. With some additions, it's already got some classes applied, it already looks better, and you'll see what it looks like once we launch it. And you'll see also some basic sort of adjustments in styles that you can use. But for the actual data, we use row template. And then for each one of these, we just use context, because context is every item in this loop, essentially. If you do a simple normal table in Blazor, you would most likely just, let's fix this, and then we can continue. You would most likely just use a for loop, or for each loop rather. And then each item, maybe you would call it item. So if in that loop the item would be called item, it would mean context, it would be item. And then you have a property of the item. Now, by MudBlazor way, they use the word context, the keyword context. So it's a for loop with keyword context. That's all it is. Row template, that's all it is. And the header is already predetermined. And you can set whatever you want. You don't need to match these name and name or email and email. You can do something like email address, and that will work perfectly fine. Or something like user role. That would still work with raw, so there's no matching or anything like that. This is just essentially a very sort of componentized fancy for loop where the item is context. That's all it is. What we can, however, do is we can do all kinds of things with the properties here. And let's say, for example, we have a status which is just a word, and it's active, inactive, and that's all great. Now, for simplicity purposes, we have a string here, but realistically, in real world, we would do more something like something a bit more fancy, like the suggestion here, actually. We want to be able to do something. Well, let's just take the suggestion, which is with errors. It's always good to take some of these suggestions, but as I mentioned previously, if you are actually modifying something, if you're actually customizing something, always be wary of these things, because sometimes they can go wrong a bit. So we can use this MudChip, and it kind of has a bit of a problem that doesn't quite matter now. But essentially, we can determine the status and then give it a more sort of a friendly look. Though for the MudChip specifically, we do need to set a few other properties, actually just one property. It does require a type of value, essentially, that we have right here. We can do type equals, say, string. Let's see if we can get that going. One interesting thing, if you do type, and you'll see that once we get to something like checkboxes, and you'll need to do like Boolean type for checkbox or select as well. But you don't need nowadays in Blazor, you don't need to put it in quotation marks. You can just do string like that. We can just copy this like here, like that. And that would be inactive And that would be perfect. So the status active, we also add a little chip, or you could do an icon or something like that, just to make it more visually appealing. But there is nothing more to add at this point. We actually have a table. A table that should ideally work. So let's launch it. Let's see if it has any errors or if it just works perfectly fine. But that's the main table structure. So now the table is launched, and as you can see, we have all our beautiful dashboard data. Obviously, perhaps adding a few margins to the whole container thing would be useful. But in general, again, this was a grid. All these active sessions, total users, that's one grid. But then the other stuff just goes into blocks, so you don't have to add any additional things. And of course, the table is fully generated. Basic, very basic table. In a few moments, I'll show you how to kind of make it more perhaps interesting, or in some cases more visually useful, not visually appealing necessarily, but just kind of easier to read. But the status, we did use those chips, and the chips are here. They're all working fine. If it's active, it's in green chip, and if it's inactive, it's in red. And of course, again, in real world, you probably wouldn't use the actual words. You would use enums and encoded integers in your database. But also join date, we have it in particular formats, so you can modify and do all those things, but essentially it just comes from a loop. But now let's get back to the code and let's see how we can modify the table a bit. Just kind of not actual sort of deep modifications or anything like that. But if you want to, say, on hover, do a little effect, you can do hover true, and also you can stripe the table quite easily. Striping provides a sort of easier look at the table, so everything doesn't blend together. That's always been a trick for many years now, for probably decades. And if you want to do that, you can certainly do that. Let's do striped true like that. So essentially, every other item in the table will be a bit more highlighted. Now, sometimes it can be confusing depending on your use case, but you can always do those things. And also, you can have the elevation. So now we can compare the difference. You'll have a striped one. Elevation is quite useful, actually, especially if you have the whole design like this. For example, we have MudPapers. So we don't necessarily have the design as such. We don't necessarily have a background, but even on the white background, you can see these are sort of floating, and the table is kind of not in set necessarily, but it's all in line. Now, this should give a bit more of a floating arrangement to the whole thing. So now we are back at the dashboard, and we can see some interesting things. Of course, it is now striped, and if you can see, when I'm hovering on each element, on each item of the table, it gets highlighted. Very useful feature, of course. These are things that you kind of get by default when using MudBlazor. You can, of course, do your own table, but you won't have this sort of easy to look at borderless arrangement. And then also, again, striping and just a hover effect. That can be perhaps not too difficult to do, but still something you need to play around with. And also now the elevation, if you can actually notice it, because it is quite subtle, but it still is there. It matches all the other dashboard elements. So now this is elevated and it's all matching perfectly fine. Now, in terms of the design, who knows? Do we need this recent user? Probably it doesn't look quite good. Maybe we could put it in the table header. Maybe we can do a grid do it like that. But that's for later videos in this series. We can modify things and make a more exciting kind of an arrangement. But with that said, let's take a look at some other items just to kind of get started properly with the whole MudBlazor arrangement. Now, not to make it too boring to explore some buttons and things, we won't be really looking at inputs and buttons as such, because a button works like a button and an input works like an input. It just has its own styles predefined. That's all great and good. What we will look at, however, is a text field with adornment button. If you've ever done one of those, you know how difficult it can be to do it customized and manually and on your own. If you've never done it, you're lucky. But let's take a look at one, and we'll just do a little search. Search for users. Very straightforward and simple arrangement, but one that can take probably many hours, if not many days sometimes, if you want it to work and look perfectly. But with MudBlazor, it's quite easy. What we will need to do in the table now, we need to do a little toolbar arrangement, as it would be called. Let's say toolbar content. Let's see what we get. Toolbar content we get. That's perfect. So we can do, in this case, this is something I mentioned previously. We could actually move recent user into the table. Perhaps the whole arrangement will look a little bit better. But let's not waste time with that. What I will do here instead is mud text field. Mud text field is essentially a text field and input. Input of type text. That's all it is. However, with MudBlazor, you can also add a button inside it. So if you have search, we've all seen a sort of search box where you enter words and inside it there's a button. And again, as mentioned before, it can be extremely difficult to actually do one yourself. It's time consuming, you need to align things, you need to do things quite perfectly. But let's do a little placeholder. You can do a placeholder, of course. We can do search. Let's just do it like this. Yeah, perfect. And the most important thing is adding an adornment. Adornment is something, a little icon essentially that we have. So in this case, it will be a search icon, a little loop glass icon. So let's do adornment. And this one doesn't actually do an icon, but this puts a position. So whether you want it on left or the right of the text field. So let's do start. Why not? Actually, let's do end. Let's see if we can do end. Can we do end? We can do end. Too many suggestions coming in, but that's the beauty of the new Visual Studio arrangement. Some people do like to turn it off and do it manually. In general, it's sort of been determined by now that it's always useful to have it on, because as annoying as it is, once you get used to it, it actually provides some speed and power to your whole development arrangement. So adornment icon is search. Perfect. It already knows what I want to do. That's all great and good. And we're just missing a few little bits and pieces perhaps in this whole arrangement. What we are missing is actually the bind for the text field, because we will need to bind the search value, and then at that point we actually will need to kind of rearrange the whole table, because we can't exactly override recent users. If you're fetching from table, it won't really work. So we do need a sort of temporary hold, a temporary list, if you will, for the values that you see. Because otherwise, we would need to every time fetch from the database, which is something you might want to do as well. You might want to just have empty recent users, and then every time you want to look them up, you just need to start searching, and you might put some restraint that you need 2 or 3 characters before you actually start searching. That may reduce the load on your database, so it's something always to consider with these search arrangements. But since we're doing just sort of pulling the data and displaying it, we will do it in a bit of a different way, which again is also valid. This way you don't need to sort of reiterate the database, go back and forth between it. You just have the data, and if it's a sort of slow moving data, that might be the arrangement for you. Especially if you have not a huge list, but a heavy query, you don't want to necessarily go through the whole arrangement of searching in the database. So what we will do here, we'll do, let's say, private. We don't really need private in these arrangements, but just for sort of by the book purposes, right? We can do it. So we have search string, perfectly fine word for it. But more importantly, what we need to do is to have essentially the result of the filtered users, which will become an enumerable, like it is suggested here. And I'm not quite sure we need this whole arrangement, so let's get rid of this, like that. And then let's just do filtered, let's see, filtered users, like that. We already have that. Filtered users, we don't need that. So we need recent users, actually. Recent users, like that. And then we just do a simple where. Now the where will essentially just go through every property in the users. Again, this is not the most efficient kind of a query, and maybe you would have categories, you would have if the filter is provided or not, and in the later videos of this series we'll get to probably some of those arrangements, how you can do more complex searches and things like that. But let's just do a little lambda here, user, not user model. Again, these suggestions, they do sometimes interfere, but in the end they can be quite useful. Like in this case, it actually provides basically what I kind of expected it to provide. We check if a search string is at all provided. Then if it's not provided, we just return all the users, essentially, right? Or we match name, email, or role, or status. We can match all those things. Or if it's we have no search query, we don't search at all, we just provide the whole list. Very simple. The more interesting arrangement, of course, is not the filtering and not the sort of basic where LINQ arrangement. You can watch some of these LINQ arrangements and more advanced ones on the channel. Take a look at all the videos of LINQ specifically. If you want to learn more about sort of filtering, and it's of course useful with entity framework to some extent, but just in general C#, if you're using C# these days, you should know how LINQ works. So take a look at the channel and take a look at the Patreon. There are some courses about C# and SQL Server and integrations of all these sort of matching arrangements in the same Microsoft family. And the source code for this will be provided as well. So let's do filter users. Filtered users will go somewhere here instead of recent users, because now we displayed filtered users. We fetch recent users right here, not from a database in this case, but it would come from database. And then we display the actual filtered users, which could be all the recent users, or it could be filtered out users from those recent users. So now all that's left to do is to activate the search string properly, because we need to bind it. Let's do bind. Bind text would be probably the best way to do this. The problem with all mud text fields or, well, mud inputs, essentially, sometimes it is enough to just bind the, let's actually bind the value. That's always a sort of easier solution. But sometimes you need to not just bind it, but also declare what type you're binding. So it isn't necessarily enough to provide there's a string or not. Of course, now in .NET 10 it has improved a lot, and that's why it's useful to go to the latest version. And there are some C# elements as well, .NET 10 elements, new ones that can make your life easier in terms of development in general. There are some discussed like null assignments, null safe assignments in this channel. Take a look at those videos, very interesting. But now we should have binding to the search string, and if it actually will change, we will be able to see the difference. We will be able to see filtered users instead of all the users that we fetch from this sort of fake database. So now once it's launched, you can see we have a table. And if, say, we take one of the names, say Alice, for example, there's sort of two ways to trigger it. We can just do keyboard press, and it works as well, which again would be quite difficult to do it yourself. All those integrations, additional JavaScript perhaps, additional things to go into that can be quite tricky. But if we remove it, and I press on the adornment icon, which actually needs a click event to become a cursor, which is a bit tricky, but you can certainly do just avoid one. It still triggers the search, and now we have all the characters and all the names displayed in this list. And again, you can move this to toolbar as well, and you can arrange your search button to whatever desired preference. And these are the sort of basics, the setup. There will be more videos in this series coming in the next weeks. Something more advanced, we will see how we can modify things, sort of arrange a CSS perhaps in our own desired way. But do check out the Patreon. There's source code available. There's also, with certain subscription tiers, free courses available, say something more modern on Solana integration with C# and other different interesting things, something more traditional, something perhaps more modern. But this is how you get started with MudBlazor, and it is a tool that can certainly save you some time. And with that said, we will conclude this video.